Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you so much for joining me as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for the worlds that Obsidian has created for us. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everybody for joining in on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity and Avowed. For those wondering why those games are paired together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so if you're new to this show, welcome to the show. Really happy to have you here. I'm going to signpost you towards episode 0, where I signpost you further to episodes that are maybe a little more foundational for the lore that exists within this world, if you just want to understand the bare bones or the basics of what's going on. But today's episode is a good place to start as well. This podcast mainly aims to just dive into the lore of the world that Eora is, to just understand the games a little bit better, appreciate the nuance of the writing, ask interesting questions, maybe help you build a character for role-playing, or if you want to use it for tabletop games, something like that. There'll be no spoilers on today's episode. We are going to be discussing monks in today's episode. In fact, we're going to be discussing the character builds for monks, and primarily I was asking myself the question of, can you build a viable monk character in Avowed as you see them in Pillars of Eternity? And it was really interesting to see what happens. So today's a very good place to start off if you are brand new. But again, if you want to check out the other episodes, feel free to do that. Before diving into today's lore, let's talk a little bit of news as it pertains to Avowed or Pillars of Eternity. Nothing Pillars of Eternity related per se, but we do have that turn-based mode coming down the pipeline that we're looking forward to. There is a little bit of Avowed news in that, well, it's officially summertime now, and so we're expecting that roadmap update for the summer to happen at some point in time. We haven't really got a date for it yet, but we have gotten a bit of a preview for it. If you were on Obsidian's latest live stream on Twitch, or I guess at least latest in terms of when I'm recording this, you were able to get a preview of their 1.5 update. Now, I wasn't able to actually watch the full preview, personally speaking, so I don't think they mentioned a date, though, because I haven't seen anything updated on Reddit or wherever else, but that information might change by the time this episode comes out. We were able to see some of the updates there. The primary thing that I'm interested in, a lot of others are interested in, is that there's going to be new weapons and armor and abilities added to the game, and so we were able to see a number of them. Thanks to user God_treachery on Reddit for posting screenshots of the things that we can see from the Obsidian live stream that they did, they gave us some a pretty good shot of the different things that we can have. So in terms of weapons, we're able to see nearly a dozen weapons of different varieties. I can see a wand, a spear, a pistol, a mace, an axe, a dagger, a bow, an arquebus, 2 hammers, and a great axe as well, or a polearm. I'm not really sure what that is, actually. There's a few different symbols I see here, and I can't really remember which ones are which. I don't think they're supposed to be adding brand new weapon types in this update, but I guess that doesn't mean they couldn't if they wanted to. So there's a number of different ones here. I don't, unfortunately, get to see the lore associated with anything in them, but we do get to see a bit of their stats. Most of it has to do with a little bit of elemental damage or resistance, as well as usually either adding a debuff to the enemy or giving you a little bit of a buff. Nothing that I saw that was like crazy good, but I'm not very good at building combat-based characters and maximizing all the numbers and things like that. But it's still going to be interesting to just chase these down, find out where they are in the game, and will, I think, merit a full replay of the game, at least will for me. On the armor side of things, it seems that there's going to be 4 new pieces of armor, although on the screenshot, one of them looks to be like a piece of armor that I think you can already get in the game, called Arcanist's Gambison, but it was featured here in this screenshot, and it makes me wonder if that is supposed to be a new one or an upgraded version of it. I'm not really sure. However, there is 3 other ones: the Storm Dancer's Scale, the Robe of Woven Grass, and Spider Silk Robe. The Spider Silk Robe looks interesting because power attacks have a 50% chance of laying down webs that will slow enemies, and as someone who primarily uses power attacks in this game, I'm kind of interested to see how well that'll play out. But yeah, that'll be interesting, again, because I like to go through and read the unique lore that's in all of these things as well. It's it's just fun to replay the game and hunt things down all over again. I'm not sure how they're going to lay them out, if it'll be obvious to find these things or not, but there we go. As well, there are going to be some new unique abilities in the perk tree that you can have for the fighter and ranger class. There are screenshots of them, and you can see, I think it looks like 5 new perks in each one. You can see in the fighter and the ranger tree a full column, and then another one off to the right at the bottom at level 20. You can see these different perks that are available. One of which looks like Mule Kick in the fighter archetype. And I'm surprised that one wasn't there at the beginning, or at least I don't think it was there at the beginning, because I remember seeing it in previews for Avowed, but I didn't really notice it after Avowed came out that it wasn't there. But I usually don't play fighters anyway, so that's partly why that might be. As far as the Ranger category goes, again, we get to see, I think, 4 or 5 different abilities laid out that are going to be brand new. One of which is called Shadow Step, which I think is a lot like the one that Marius has, where you step into the beyond, you kind of disappear for a second, and you reappear behind your enemy. So this will be a useful one when you need to get behind enemies that are far away. And I know right now I'm kind of going through a Path of the Damned playthrough, so that will be fairly useful for me. But as far as abilities in that go, the thing I really want to ask today is, what abilities are there that currently exist that would be good for a monk run, and can you build a monk in the game of Avowed as you see them in Pillars of Eternity? So that's what we're going to get into right away. I guess the last thing I want to say before we jump into the lore is that I'm recording this at an awkward time, so hopefully I get everything out that I want to talk about. I just got back from the hospital from breaking my foot for completely noble and righteous reasons. I definitely didn't roll my ankle while running and chasing my son throughout our house when we were playing a game. So that's definitely not what happened. Anyways, let's dive into the lore for today.
Half the locals would arrest you for trespassing and the rest would kill you outright. I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
I find it funny that I'm doing the episode on monks today which I often call the punchy kicky people, and I am crippled from a broken foot. So that's always been fun. But there we go. That's what we're going to be talking about today, because damn it, that's what I researched and prepared for. So I started asking myself this question a while ago when I was playing Avowed and I noticed the Iron Fist perks in the fighter category. And I don't pay attention much to the fighter category because it's just not my playstyle. But as I was exploring second, third, and fourth playthroughs of the game, kind of going in parallel, I was goofing around with different builds, and I finally got to the Iron Fist perk, and I was wondering to myself, can you build a viable monk character in Avowed, at least as we see them in Pillars of Eternity? Because I had looked up before, Avowed unarmed build, and you can find a really decent build of a combative character that, you can just use your fists through the entirety of the game, and you can do pretty good. I didn't really doubt the ability for that. I think Obsidian has done a good job of creating perks and abilities that can complement each other and work together and synergize towards a really powerful build in any kind of a way that you want. The thing I was really interested in, though, is can you build a monk and roleplay as a monk that is very lore accurate within this world? And I was actually rather surprised and excited about some of the things I was able to find. So in order to properly explain this, I do need to talk a little bit about what a monk is within the world of Pillars of Eternity, or at least the class of character that we see in Pillars of Eternity, and what a monk kind of character would be if you were to play as one. Looking at pillarsofeternity.fandom.com, the monk is described as a resilient fighter capable of ignoring damage or even channeling the damage into powering their abilities. They have an array of effects to bolster the effects of their melee attacks, protect the monk from afflictions, or turn the tables on attackers. Monks belong to a variety of fighting orders that have sprung up in Shadowmill and the Eastern Reach over the past few centuries. While many monastic orders can trace their teachings to the enduring founder, Tilitak, individual orders may vary greatly in their focus, morality, and ethics. Common folk respect an incredible amount of discipline monks seem to see them as odd, and they're the unpredictable bunch who may not be entirely sane. Even mercenaries and other adventurers aren't sure what to make of them. So, a monk character in Pillars of Eternity, as a class that you can play, is largely founded on these martial monastic orders. And they have a history based in the Shadowmill Plains or Eastern Reach, which the Eastern Reach is the larger part of the setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game. Eastern Reach is the continent that the Pillars of Eternity game is placed on, although it's in the nation of the Deerwood, which is in itself on that continent. Ishadamel Plains is another nation within that continent, but you don't actually get to go there in the Pillars of Eternity game. It's just a place within the world that people can come from. It's an ancient place, and it's got a very philosophical bent to it, so it's not a lot of surprise that there would be monastic orders that come from Ishadamel Plains. And it seems that monk orders that we see within Pillars of Eternity, and again, I don't think that the monk player class in Pillars of Eternity is meant to, represent the entire idea of what a monk could be. This is just in terms of like what you can play as a character. I think there can be monastic orders that are non-violent. There's probably monastic orders that don't have any focus on, fighting disciplines or martial prowess, anything like that. There can probably be monastic orders in different senses. But as far as role-playing a monk in the game, this is kind of the history of where these kind of monks come from and how they work. Because the classes in Pillars of Eternity and the class that you can kind of build in Avowed, they have a place in the world and a history, and they have a way in which they operate. I've talked about this before, that how any particular class in Pillars of Eternity or character that you can make in Avowed, the way that they're able to do their, superhuman abilities is not because you're just a special person who is God-touched or something like that. It is because you're interacting with essence in some way, shape, or form. Every person that does things that is of the magical effect or of superhuman or super person capability, you're interacting with essence. Essence, for those who don't know, is the stuff that souls are made of in this world. So you and I have a soul, and that soul is made up of essence. But essence isn't just in the soul of a person. Essence also can exist in living things, like trees, rocks, and even in the ambient environment around you. And it's interacting with essence in different ways and forms that create these classes of characters that we see. The Cypher, for example, uses another person's soul, or the essence in another person's soul, as the focus for their magic, and that's why often their magic and spellcasting is very psionically based. A wizard will use a special book called a grimoire, and they will basically filter essence through the grimoire, which forms it into a spell that can then be cast out in front of them. Chanters will interact with the essence in the ambient environment around them and stir the memory within that essence to essentially reenact something from history past in the form of a spell. When it comes to monks, the focus of their sort is their own soul, and what they do is they inflict pain upon themselves in order to bolster and energize their soul so that they can release that energy in the form of a superhuman or superperson ability or trait. And so I believe this is called mortification. I always call it mortification of the flesh, and I don't know if that's actually what it's called. I might just be getting that from like one of my favorite heavy metal bands or something like that. But the idea being that a monk person, at least in terms of like these character builds, they inflict mortification upon themselves. And this pain and this suffering somehow energizes their soul. It somehow bolsters the energy inside of it. And then they release that energy, if you will, in the form of superhuman abilities. And with monks, it's usually things like punching people way faster than you can possibly do, dashing across the map at lightning speeds, or making kind of like a dual copy of yourself. There's a lot of interesting things that the monks can do, at least that you can see in Pillars of Eternity. And so as you are getting damaged in, let's say, Pillars of Eternity, you are building up this thing called wounds, capital W wounds. So the more damage you take, the more wounds you have. When you have enough wounds, you expend those wounds to perform these abilities in the game. And that's just kind of how the gamey side of it works, but that's also kind of how the lore side of it works, is that this pain and suffering emboldens these people to do these abilities. And quite often, as we are pretty used to seeing in a lot of other fantasy settings that do include monks, like Dungeons & Dragons or Pathfinder, or a lot of other fantasy-based media, especially video games, where you can have an unarmed build, it's very often tied towards the monk class. I played a monk as my first character in Baldur's Gate 3, and it was one of my most satisfying playthroughs ever. And in terms of Pillars of Eternity, or just the World of Eora at large, it's really interesting to roleplay as a character that does follow a monastic order. And one of my favorite companions at all throughout the entirety of all of the games is Zawa from Pillars of Eternity 1 in the White March DLC. There's a lot of interesting lore behind monks. There's a bunch of different monastic orders that I do take time to look at in my own episode about monks. If you want to go and check that one out, feel free to do so. But the question I have today is that can we build a character in Avowed that is a lot like any monk we see from Pillars of Eternity, or at least is lore-friendly in that entire way? So I am not focused on creating the best build for a monk, one that can like one-punch everybody to death. I am looking to see can we make a monk in Avowed that is really lore friendly, and that is kind of consistent in that way, shape, or form. And again, I was pleasantly surprised to find what I could find. So first off, let's get started on like something like character creation, the very first things that we're going to have. If you are wanting to create a monk in Avowed, that is something like what we see in Pillars of Eternity, we have 3 main attributes to focus on. When you're playing Pillars of Eternity, if you have the like tooltips turned on, it puts little stars next to the attributes that are typically good for monk characters. Technically speaking, you can play with any kind of mix of statistics or attributes in Pillars of Eternity, but there, especially if you're new to the game, there are some that are better for other classes. With monks, you're wanting to focus on being able to take a lot of damage so that you can obviously gain these wounds and expend them in forms of energy, but you're also going to want to be able to focus on moving really quickly or dodging attacks that could hurt you. I think even if attacks miss, you still can build wounds. I can't remember that exactly. And then, of course, you want to be able to focus on actually doling out damage because you're building up all this energy. And so the recommended attributes that you're supposed to have in Pillars of Eternity is Constitution and Dexterity primarily, followed by Might. And those attributes do follow over from Pillars of Eternity into Avowed. And so if you are going to create a lore-centric focus of a monk in Avowed, then you're going to want to focus on those attributes, Constitution, Dexterity, and then Might. And this makes sense too, right? Because if you think about a person who is mortifying their own flesh, you're going to want to have a high Constitution to even survive that kind of a thing. And these people are focusing on martial prowess, so Dexterity and Might make the most sense. Dexterity over Might in the sense of I think they're trying to be graceful or acrobatic about it, or they have like a technique that they have mastered. And it's not necessarily about are you stronger than your opponent, but are you good at the technique that you have? And so I think Dexterity over Might makes a lot of sense there. So we want to build our character that they're able to have those statistics be the main ones. I don't think you need to have a particular background in Avowed to be really consistent with it. I think you could be a monk that fits into any of the backgrounds here. If you wanted to be an arcane scholar, that if you would just also like, as you're disciplining your mind, you're also disciplining your body, that kind of thing. If you were a court augur, perhaps you got really interested in this idea of like pain, somehow suffusing your soul with power. As a noble scion, perhaps this was an escape or something like that. Maybe it's part of like your history as a noble that you were connected to a monastic order. And Vanguard Scout or War Hero backgrounds, I think also can very easily make a lot of sense. Like you could have been in a monastic order, but you could have also been a scout within that order. Or you could have trained as a monk and then ended up fighting in some sort of battle. So being a war hero, that makes sense. So I don't think you're really restricted in the backgrounds. And as far as the characters look, I don't think there's a lot of restrictions there as well. Now, in terms of abilities, I think there's a lot of breadth here. There's a lot of options that we can take. I do think there are going to be some that are very necessary if you want to have like a very consistent build from monks as we see them in Pillars of Eternity. One being the Iron Fists perk, which upgrades the quality of your unarmed attacks. So if you're very familiar with Avowed, you're upgrading your weapons and armor as you go. And as you upgrade your weapons, they're going from, common to rare to fine or whatever it is. And you're upgrading these weapons to different tiers of quality. And this perk allows you to do that for your unarmed attacks. So this is going to be the primary focus of a monk build. And that one's one you can find in the fighter category. In the ranger category, the one that I think is really important is the flurry of blows. And this is because it's very much a monk ability. Like this is actually one that I think they took straight from Pillars of Eternity. I think they renamed it, technically speaking. But this is also, I think flurry of blows is also something they see in Dungeons and Dragons. Like I think it's actually what it's called. So this is very much a monk flavored ability. And this gives you maximum attack speed and rapid stamina regeneration, and it accrues your move speed for a while. And so right there, we're kind of getting understanding of this build about you're moving very quickly. You're also able to take lots of damage. And so when I was building this character, I also really maximized my ability to dodge, and I grabbed other perks that made me do that, such as evasive or things like that. The last trait that I would say is fairly required, but I don't know if necessarily, is blood magic out of the wizard tree. And this one is when your essence is depleted, and essence is kind of the meter that you have in Avowed to be able to perform superhuman abilities. I like this one because it really fits in the lore that says when your essence meter is depleted, you may continue casting by instead reducing your health at a certain cost. And so basically the idea being that you are hurting yourself, and because you're hurting yourself, you're able to then do your abilities. You're able to cast these superhuman abilities. I like that idea because it really fits with the the idea behind a monk character as someone who is taking pain, and that's represented by your health bar going down, and now using that pain to then cast other, sort of spells or abilities or things like that. So it really lines up with the lore. So I would say blood magic is definitely a required one for that. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of active abilities that I would necessarily choose for the monk class. A lot of the ones I went and picked were mostly passive. But I do think there are some that can be very, monk-esque, if you will, such as the charge ability in the fighter tree, because that is you basically just flying across the battlefield and hitting and kicking someone really hard and knocking them down, right? And that is something we see monks do in Pillars of Eternity, where they're at one side of the battlefield and you just zip over to the other side and knock somebody over. So I think charge, even though technically it is actually a fighter ability from Pillars of Eternity, I think this one matches up and lines up well enough. The power jump as well, I think, is one that you could use, but that is also another passive ability. I could see other things counting as well, such as Barbaric Shout, which lets out a roar that interrupts enemies around you. That is an active ability as well, so you could do that. You could also make an argument for some of the wizard spells if you wanted to be able to cast certain spells that made sense and were consistent with your character in some way, shape, or form. And at that point, I think it's just up to the flavor of character you want to build. And that's good, because I think you want to have a little bit of breadth so that you can make your character in a unique way. I focused mostly on things that were very acrobatic or passive, or not, mostly passive. Power Slide is another one that I wanted to include in there. Critical Strike was one that I thought was really useful. Anything involving increasing stamina or having my health regenerate. I was a little unsure about health regeneration, because it's like, is that really in line with what a monk does? Because they want to be like in pain, so health regeneration would almost signify that they don't want to do that. However, I decided that it was okay, because then it's more health for you to deplete. So really, in a sense, you're just giving yourself more opportunity to hurt yourself, thus, being a monk. As well, taking the trait from the wizard tree that allows essence, or I guess it allows you to use light armor without as much of a penalty. And the reason I chose that is because there is actually a specific piece of armor that you can get that is very, very much tied to monks. And so this is where I'm going to get into the part of the build where what you wear and what is on your exterior and how you are presenting yourself is what is really getting across the idea that you are a monk in this world. Now, originally, I was going to go with Necro Pants as your armor of choice because, one, the Necro Pants, if you read the item description for them, they have these little pins inside of them that stick into your legs, and so they're very uncomfortable and they're actually painful, and that's very much, I think, in line with what monks are like. So if you're going to make a monk character in Avowed and you want to really stick with the lore, I think Necro Pants is a really good choice in terms of being lore friendly, because, again, like, you're constantly just uncomfortable and in a little bit of pain, and that very much matches alongside with what monks would do. As well, it kind of looked monkish, like you're just walking around in basically leggings with no shirt, and that's how we meet Zawa, basically one of the poster childs for what a monk looks like in the game of Pillars of Eternity. So I think that one fits very well. The other one that I chose, though, was Hellwalker's Vestments, and this is because Hellwalker, Helwalker, is actually a subclass of monk that you can choose in Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. So in Pillars of Eternity 1, you didn't get subclasses, but in Pillars of Eternity 2, you did get subclasses, and it kind of came with a give and take where you would get a benefit, but it would cost you something. But there was always this little bit of lore that came with it. So in the example of a Hellwalker character in Pillars of Eternity 2, if you chose the Hellwalker as the subclass, you would begin your combat with more wounds, so you would be able to do more monk stuff right off the bat. And you would also increase your might attribute for each wound that you have, so you're more strong with these wounds. However, the penalty for this is that you take more damage for every wound that you have. So if you have a lot of wounds, you dish out more damage, but you also take more damage. So that's kind of the give and take there. But the lore is really what I'm focusing on, and a Hellwalker monk has a really interesting background. And the little flavor text for Hellwalker in Pillars of Eternity 2 reads, "All Hellwalkers undergo a ceremonial death rite as part of their initiation. The experience allows them to start combat with extra wounds and to draw physical strength from their wounds at the cost of increased vulnerability." And we can read this lore as well in Avowed if you have the Hellwalker's Vestments as your armor, and this is light armor. You read the item description, which for all unique weapons and armor includes actual lore within the world. It says, out of all the monastic orders that dot the face of Eora, none are as attuned with the concept of suffering and pain as the Hellwalkers. The ceremonial death rite that these monks undergo as part of their initiation is a wretchedly painful experience that few have the endurance to withstand. Their vestments embody the Hellwalker's relationship with pain, amplifying the suffering that the wearer both receives from enemies and dispenses in return. So wearing the Hellwalker's vestments, shows you, one, that you got into the Hellwalkers. I guess technically you just say that you found them, in Galawain's tusks. But for me, I'm thinking, especially if I was to do a New Game Plus and I had them from the get-go, if your character is a Hellwalker monk, then you at some point, died before coming to the Living Lands, and it was a ceremonial death that you endured and surpassed to join the Hellwalkers. And this makes sense from a lore perspective with monks, in the sense that, if it's all about pain and suffering, emboldening the soul, and that's really what monks are about, enduring pain and suffering to the point of death would make you so familiar with what that is that you would be a master in that and being able to utilize that. And it's represented in the game aspects of, well, when you have the Hellwalker's vestments, you get plus 25 melee damage, 25%, but you also receive 50% damage less in your damage reduction, so you take more damage as a result. And so if you're going to run with the Hellwalker's vestments as part of your build, as your lore crafting a monk in Avowed, you're going to want to make sure that you have a lot of health, or that you can regenerate health, or that you are very good at dodging and just not taking damage in the first place. Although, again, technically, you're supposed to be taking damage and then using that to, enhance your effects. But that's what the blood magic trait is for. And I think if you are going to go down that route, another thing that you can think about in terms of backgrounds and character creation is maybe choosing Court Augur, because they're a little bit metaphysical and weird. The Court Augur is very much like the mystic background from Pillars of Eternity. And so I think those kind of light up really well. But again, I think you could choose any background and it would work. I just think Court Augur really matches in terms of flavor. But if you're going with Necropants, then maybe go with something else. In terms of other things that you can have on your person when you're playing as a monk in Avowed, there are 2 rings that I'm going to mainly recommend, because they are very clearly a reference to monks from Pillars of Eternity. One is a ring called a Band of Transcendent Suffering. This gives you more melee damage, but also decreases your damage reduction more again. So the lore for this reads, an ancient elf monk that adhered strictly to the Shattered Pillar philosophy created this ring as the last act of their long life. This ring causes the wearer's entire body to tingle with a barely restrained power as barbs of pure essence latch onto their soul. The strength that it imbues the wearer with is undeniable, but it draws upon the very life of the wearer to do so. Truly, using this band is the ultimate show of confidence that one has in their own prowess. So not only was the Band of Transcendent Suffering created by an elven monk, they also adhered to the Shattered Pillar philosophy. The Shattered Pillar is actually another subclass that you can pick from Deadfire game. The Shattered Pillar monastic order says that unlike other monastic orders, the monks of the Shattered Pillar philosophy gain power from causing pain and harm. While not inherently sadistic, the order does attract many practitioners who delight in the suffering of others. So this is a monk order that doesn't focus on their own pain, but the pain of another person. And so the focus of their superhuman abilities and their magic, if you will, is another person's pain. And so they inflict pain on people. It's not inherently sadistic, but oftentimes you do get sadistic people that become Shattered Pillar monks. Now, because of this reason, if you wanted to maybe roleplay as a little bit of a Hellwalker and a little bit of a Shattered Pillar, I do also recommend that you select any glove in the game of Avowed that doesn't have any sort of padding on the hands, so as to maybe not, reduce the suffering that you would have, or to wear gloves that alternatively have something that inflict even more damage onto other people if you're wanting to maybe use their pain as a way, lore-wise. Right? So in terms of like what you would wear as gloves, I'd recommend something like that. Anything that is either not padding your hand or is basically weaponized to hurt other people more. But yeah, so you have the Band of Transcendent Suffering. And now the Band of Transcendent Suffering references a trait of monks from Pillars of Eternity called Transcendent Suffering. This is actually a trait of monks that are in the game. That's what the name of the trait is. So this ring is very clearly referencing that trait from the Pillars of Eternity game. So it matches on a lore-based kind of perspective. The other ring I'm going to recommend is called Ring of Pain Amplification. And I don't think that's any surprise based on the name alone. It gives you plus 15% critical damage against enemies. The lore for this reads, small sharp needles emerge from the inside of this rusted iron ring once it has settled snugly on the wearer's finger. The acute pain that this causes lasts for but a moment before fading away to a dull ache. Decisive blows are greatly amplified thanks to this ring's agony-enhancing enchantment. Whoever made this ring clearly had an appreciation for the fine art of mutual suffering. So I think this is very clearly another ring that you can wear, and because you're already moving towards extra critical damage, I think it also makes sense to choose perks in the Avowed skill trees that increase your chance of critical hits as well as increasing critical damage. So I just kind of built off of these things and created the character around that. I also like ring of pain amplification, because if you are kind of walking that line between Hellwalker and Shattered Pillar, it's this like in between where you're causing yourself pain. And so you're bolstering your own soul from that, but it's also making you hurt other people more. So if you're kind of walking that line of, well, what kind of monk are you? I think this is a really good one to have that's, in that middle ground. In terms of like what trinket or accessory to wear in Avowed, I think you're actually free and clear to choose pretty much any of them. I don't think there's any one that stands out above the rest that really should be required. For myself, I chose Revenant Collar, Bell Collar, because originally, I was going with Necropants, and those two literally go together for an achievement in the game, so it just kind of made sense. But as well, I kind of felt like it matched how I view monks in this world. You're wearing this thing that's probably not very comfortable. It's kind of a little bit of annoying. It probably doesn't smell very good if it was previously used. And it's also kind of like a collar, like a shackle for slavery, and I feel like that's kind of like mentally oppressive. So I felt like it really matched the flavor of monks in Eora. But again, I think this is where you, as a player, you can kind of choose which one you think fits the best in terms of lore, or also really goes along with the rest of the items that you already find in Avowed that really complement each other for a build that you would like. And that, my friends, is the Avowed monk character build that you can have. Now, again, I'm focusing mostly on the roleplay of all this, so don't focus too much on making like the best combative build that you're going to use in a Path of the Damned run. But if this is something that you're interested in doing, to see, like, can I make a character that is lore-friendly in Avowed that matches with Pillars of Eternity? I think it's totally doable. And not only is it doable, it actually has a little bit of wiggle room where you could say that you used to be part of this one monastic order, or you are part of this other monastic order, or you're not part of either of them. But there's some wiggle room within that. So it's not just one build that you can make, even though that would have been fine. And I like that there are ways to really create the character as a combative person as well that matches with a lot of this stuff. And so for those of you out there who are crazy about building monks in games, I totally go for it, because I think that it's a fun character to be. I have already, started my monk run, and I actually used it as my speed run technically to beat the game in 3 hours, because I'm like, well, I don't need to be upgrading my weapons. I just need to upgrade my fist armor and stuff like that. And I was playing on storytime mode, so I was allowed to die as much as I wanted without worrying about starting over. Also helped out as well. But that's the character I used. I beat it in 3 hours as a result. It was pretty straightforward to do. Before we sign off and close out today's episode, I'm just going to read one monk-related thing to you that we find, especially in Avowed, since we are talking about Avowed, but this is a book that you can get from Pillars of Eternity, and so it spans across both games. And this is a book called The Legacy of the Takan, and this is about the Takan people, which were a culture in the Shadowmill Plains, and they're most notable for creating the Naupazka monk order, which, if I remember correctly, is the monk order that Zawa, a companion from the first Pillars game, is a member of. This slim volume tells the tale of the Takan, a people who lived along the banks of the Aku River on the fertile Exachimel Plains. It details their rise to prominence in the region and their eventual demise at the hands of their ancient enemies, the Quechmatl people. A significant portion of the book is given over to examining the role of Takan's order of monks, the Naupazka, in Takan society. The Naupazka believed that transcendence could only be attained by overcoming one's personal vanity, the desire for pleasure, and fear of death. To that end, they engaged in pointedly antisocial behavior, various forms of self-mutilation, and meditation with or consumption of the recently deceased. The Naupazka were led by Anitle, or Master Warrior, the last of whom was named Ishapillo. Ishapillo was charged with protecting his people from the Quechmatl and other threats, but in a tragic twist of fate, Ishapillo died before he was able to pass on his sacred knowledge onto the man poised to take his place. The book dwells on this failure for some time, its author apparently of the belief that it was this one error that gave the Quechmatl the opening key that they needed to launch their attack. The book's author goes on to describe how they attempted to instigate a popular uprising among his people against the Quishmattle, but his efforts were unsuccessful, as the Takan were by then too broken by the destruction of their culture to muster much of a defense. The volume concludes with an exhortation for the reader not to mourn the Takan's passing, but to learn what they had to teach, and to teach others in turn. So just a little interesting story there about the Takan people and the order of monks that they created, the Nalpasca order, and the really odd, weird ducks that they are, even as far as monks go. And when you meet Zawa, who is a person from that monastic order, he very much is like that. You find him in a barrel of fish because he felt like that would be the most repulsive thing for people around him. He's covered in wounds, and he constantly does things that, he has social behaviors that people find irritating or annoying or outright rude or just even bad. And as a result, he's apparently maligned by everyone around him. I personally loved him, thought he was hilarious, and he's great to have around, but that was just me. So let's close off today's episode, and then I guess nothing else after that. So let's do that.
If you find your trail has run cold, come to me with whatever you have. There is much I may be able to do for you.
If you liked today's episode, please send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. Let me know what you liked about it. Ask some questions. Maybe tell me if you plan on doing a monk run, or if you already did, or if it's something you thought that I missed. If you had a question, comment, or maybe you didn't like the episode and you want to criticize it. Again, worldofeora@gmail.com is the place to do that. If you want to follow the show on Twitter, you can do so at World of Eora, where I mostly post updates on the show, like when an episode is coming out or things like that. If you want to support the show, you can do so in a couple of ways. One, you can go to ko-fi.com/World of Eora, and you can support the show financially. I usually give a little bit of money to my wife for coffee, but also I keep it aside if anything needs to be repaired, like if I need a new microphone or something like that, or any other ways to support the show that you really want to have. But if you don't want to support the show in that way, and that's totally fine, I don't actually expect anyone to do this. I will do this show for free. That's just there for people who get value out of doing things like that with things that they listen to and consume online. But if you do want to support the show, just not in that way, please consider giving a rating and review or engaging with the platform that you're listening to this on in any way, so that the algorithm knows to pass this along to people that listen to similar podcasts as you do. It helps other people find it. And even though I don't really have a lot of stock in that, I'm not doing this to get tons and tons of views, it's always nice to know that there might be other people out there who would enjoy this content. As far as what I've been playing, which is what I usually talk about at this point, I haven't really been playing much since finishing The Altars, which it was a mixed bag of a game for me. I really didn't think I was going to see that game through the end, and by the end of the game, it got me to the end. I was very excited about what was going on, and I think that The Altars has a lot of really interesting things to say about the human condition, about how our identity changes based off of our lived experience, whether there are some traits about ourselves that are inherent and cannot be changed, or what things can be changed. I think that there's a little bit of controversy on that, as well, what motivates you as a person, why do you do the things you do? What matters to you? Why do you choose to live a life towards this purpose rather than that purpose? And why does this other person do, the opposite? And is there validity in both views, or is one better than the other? And I think The Altars does a really cool job of subtly asking those questions, because you're engaging with this character who basically clones himself, but he alters the clones so that they have different lived experiences than the one he has. And these people think differently than him, even though they're technically the same person. They just have a different lived experience. It's a very interesting game. I had some frustrations with it, but I think overall it's a great game. If you're into anything 11-Bit Studios has done, and they made Frostpunk, for example, I definitely recommend checking it out, especially since it's on Game Pass. But now that I've finished that game, I'm kind of just waiting for Neverwinter Nights 2 Enhanced Edition to come out to get my hands into that a little bit, as well as Grounded 2, which is coming out in early access later this month. So other than that, I might replay some more of Avowed. I'm just kind of wanting to hold off on Avowed a little bit, because I don't want to get too full of Avowed and then the summer update comes up and I have a reason to replay it again, but I've been playing too much of it. So I might replay a little bit of Pillars of Eternity. I always have some fun characters that I haven't finished a gameplay of that. And yeah, that'll be me. What have you been playing? Send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. Anyways, thanks for listening to today's episode, guys and gals. I hope you enjoyed it. And if this is something that you want to see more kind of episodes of, let me know, because you can ask this question for any of the characters or classes that you see in Pillars of Eternity. Can you create a paladin in the game of Avowed that really lines up with paladins from Pillars, or within the world of Eora at large? Can you create a druid kind of character, even though you can't shapeshift into another animal? I like kind of taking this approach and asking, can I make character XYZ that I've seen in either previous gameplay mechanics or from just previous lore? Can I make that kind of character in Avowed? And I do find that kind of thing interesting. The only thing I don't like about it is replaying Tutorial Island on Avowed over and over and over again, which I'm sure a lot of you understand. It's just like the opening scene in Skyrim, having to go through that 100,000 times every time you think of a new character you want to play. But anyways, that's enough from me from today. Thanks everyone for listening to today's episode about monks and whether or not you can create a lore-friendly one in the game of Avowed. I hope that your interest is piqued and that maybe some of you will try out a monk build in the game of Avowed. If you do, let me know what your experience is like. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.